Hey everybody, how's it going? It's July 24th, 2025, about 11:23. Welcome to the Bro Man with an Opinion podcast. I actually have recorded a show about the Diddy verdict, but for some reason, equipment wasn't cooperating, couldn't get it uploaded. At this point, it probably doesn't really make sense to upload. It's a little outdated, but I'll probably get back to Diddy a little bit later. Uh, so much going on in the world right now. So many things to talk about. But the big thing, and I apologize if you hear my neighbor's dog barking right now. The big news, obviously, today is the passing of Hulk Hogan at the age of 71. We had some other deaths, obviously, Ozzy Osbourne and Malcolm Jamal Warner from The Cosby Show. I'm going to do a separate podcast on the both of them. Um, I think it's warranted. But today definitely to talk about Hulk Hogan and just looking. First of all, let me say this. Now, I was not a huge fan of Hulk Hogan, and when I say that, I'm not talking about because of his scandal. I'm not talking about because of the sex tape. I'm not talking about because he was caught on recording making racial comments and how he would want his daughter to date, a black guy. I think he said unless it's a basketball player or something like that, or an athlete or something like that. Um, and he gave like a half-hearted apology. That's not what I mean when I say I'm not a fan of him. That stuff's irrelevant at least, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I was just not a fan because I did not grow up watching Hulk Hogan. I knew who Hulk Hogan was, but I wasn't like an oh my god diehard fan like many who grew up watching him. I started watching wrestling, um, you know, really in '95, but like really enough to remember people and wrestlers who I really liked. I would say would really be '97 because in '95, '96 wasn't really watching it religiously. We lived in a two-bedroom apartment. My sister was older. For some reason she got to control the TV in the living room, and she was into wrestling until my dad took us to a live wrestling show at the Westchester County Center in White Plains, and I guess seeing it up and close and seeing that it's not real, that it kind of killed it for her. So she stopped watching, and my mom thought it was nonsense. So I really wasn't watching in her room, and I didn't have cable in the bedroom, so I really couldn't watch. If I wanted to see a pay per view, I had to go to my dad's house because he had, the illegal cable back then, and you got to see the pay per views and everything like that. And sometimes, when you had the illegal cable, if you guys remember back then, sometimes you get a clear picture. Other times it was like squiggly, and you really couldn't tell what was going on. So it really wasn't until like '97, I was a little bit older, I really got to watch wrestling. But by that point, Hogan was gone. Hogan was in WCW, and I didn't watch WCW. And it's funny because when I was thinking about this, like my school, or at least my class in elementary school, for those who watch wrestling, everybody was WWF. It was WWF back then. Was WWF fans. So nobody was watching WCW. Nobody was talking about WCW. Nobody was talking about the NWO or Hogan being the third man. Nobody was talking about that in elementary school because everybody was watching Bret Hart and the Nation of Domination, and when The Rock was coming up, and Ken Shamrock, and the Headbangers and the Godwins and the Smoking Guns and Sonny and Sable and Goldust, Ultimate Warrior, Diesel, Kevin Nash before he went over to WCW. So I really, I don't even think, to tell you the truth, I haven't even seen. Let me correct that. I didn't watch my first Hulk Hogan match or even WCW match until Ultimate Warrior died, because everybody had just talked about WCW brought in Ultimate Warrior to face Hogan so Hogan get his win back from WrestleMania. And I watched it on YouTube. And that was the first match I watched from WCW, and that was the first match of Hulk Hogan I ever watched. Now, since then, I have gone back and, I've seen bits and pieces of some of his earlier matches. Obviously, I saw him wrestle The Rock. I saw him wrestle, Vince McMahon. I saw him wrestle Triple H, but that's because that was like, he came back to WWE in 2002. So that's where I really got to see Hogan. Um, but yeah, much of his, really all of his WCW run, I didn't see. And when he was in WWF, I didn't see it. Obviously I was too young to see him slam Andre. I didn't see him face, Sergeant Slaughter wrestle me. I didn't see him wrestle, Macho Man. I didn't see any of that stuff. So I heard of Hogan and all that stuff, but I guess I don't have the same appreciation as everybody else does because they knew him going up. I actually told my coworker today because I said, we were talking about when Ozzy Osbourne died a couple of days ago, and I was saying, it happens in threes. It really does. This case maybe four, because some famous musician also passed away today, or it was announced today. But usually, deaths happens in threes. So you had Michael Jamal Warner, you had Ozzy Osbourne, and you had Hulk Hogan. Um, but what I was looking at with Hogan was that I was looking to see what people were going to say. Was it going to be universal love? Was it going to be universal hate? Or was it going to be a mix? And it was a mixed bag. And, for those, and it's just my opinion, that's why it's called Bro Man with an Opinion podcast. Those who were saying good riddance or just sort of making the crash jokes and stuff like that. Some of the anger, yes, still stems from what he said on that tape. But a lot of the anger today is coming from because he was, a staunch advocate for Trump. He spoke at the Republican National Convention for Trump. He was a big Trumper. And then, I don't know, what was it, 2-3 months ago or something like that, when he went to, he was in California where he appeared on Raw, and I think it was in California, and he was booed out of the building. And a lot of that was because he was in a blue state, and what he just did with uh, Trump. Now, for those people who don't like him, who could care less that he passed away, or who are making the crass comments, you know, I kind of feel like you're wrapping him up into this one ball. And you have to now I get he was doing all this under the Hulk Hogan persona, but I think you have to separate. If you look at Eric Bischoff's post, he was talking about Terry Bolla, not Hulk Hogan, the wrestler, the entertainer, Terry Bolla, the person. Obviously, we in the world, we all knew him as Hulk Hogan, but we know him as Hulk Hogan, the wrestler. We know him as Hulk Hogan, the entertainer, and you can say Hulk Hogan, the Trump supporter. But I just feel like you have to separate. You have to separate it. And I think you can respect Hulk Hogan the wrestler because Hulk Hogan did do a lot for wrestling. And I did see a post where it was like, WWE needs to do a big tribute because of him, they're still a business. That's not entirely correct or really a fair statement. Yes, he saved them in the 80s. He put them on the map and launched them into the stratosphere. But they're not still in business today because of him, because yes, he launched them in the 80s. But, I think Stone Cold Steve Austin would argue, well, what do you mean, he the business to him because of him? Yeah, he kept the business going, but then I came and then I took it to the next level. And then I think The Rock would say, yeah, then I took it to the next level. And then John Cena's going to say, I took it to the next level. And then Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins, they're going to say, we're taking it to the next level. So, to sit there and say that the wrestling business is here because of today, I don't think it's necessarily fair because you had so many others come. Did he build the building blocks? Yes. Did he put something there so it could continue? Yes, but why did it continue? It continued because the torch kept getting passed to that next generation to take it to the new heights. And Stone Cold took wrestling to its new heights. So I can respect Hulk Hogan, the wrestler. I don't have any issues with Hulk Hogan, the wrestler. So to me, it's like the same thing with Michael Jackson. There are people who see him as the pedophile and that he did all these things with kids and he was crazy, his nose is for all kind of stuff. But when I think of Michael Jackson, I think about Michael Jackson the entertainer. I think about what he did on stage, how he thrilled the fans. I'm 39 years old. or going to be 39 years old in a few months. I have watched Michael Jackson videos, I don't know how many times. But sometimes when I'm feeling nostalgic, I'll go back and watch it. I'll watch his live views, his live concerts. I'll watch his music videos. And I still, even if I've seen it 100 times, I still get goosebumps watching him because he was such a good performer and a good singer. I mean, he was amazing. And despite what you think he may or may not have done, you cannot take the talent away. And as much as people may dislike Hulk Hogan because he was a Trump supporter, because especially more so in the African American community because of what he said on tape, you cannot take away what this man has done. Same thing with Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit did a horrible, horrible thing. He killed his young son. He killed his wife, and then he took the coward's way out and killed himself. I can separate that. You know what? But Chris Benoit, he had some damn good matches and was a good wrestler. And there are some good memories and great. I mean, Kurt Angle talks about it all the time. His match with him at the Royal Rumble, and you can't get mad at Kurt Angle for saying that because Kurt Angle didn't know the monster that killed his family. Kurt Angle knew the wrestler that he traveled up and down the road with, and a lot of fans know Hulk Hogan for the late drop, for hulking up, for say your prayers, drink your milk, or take your vitamins, or whatever it is. Forgive me, I don't know. They remember him being in the Rocky movies. They remember him, was it Mr. Babysitter or something like that. They remember, Hogan Knows Best, the reality show. They remember all these things because that was him. That was Hulk Hogan, the wrestler. And I think you cannot rob somebody of their memories of what he did. You know, I remember the leg drop. I remember the crowd going crazy at WrestleMania 18 when he faced The Rock. I remember when he faced Vince McMahon, WrestleMania 19. He got one more run with the WWE Championship where he defeated Triple H at Backlash in 2002. You know, so I just I get why people could care less, but at the same time, I feel like when I've read some of those comments, you're crapping on the people who miss him. Now, am I crying tears for him? No. And there are going to be some people out there who are going to take it really hard. Like, now, me, I'm not one of those people. I can't cry for somebody who I didn't know. As much as I like Michael Jackson, I did not boo-hoo when he passed away. When Kobe Bryant died, terrible way that he died, him and his daughter in that plane crash. But I had a friend who was like depressed about it. And he's like, I looked up to you, he was my idol, all that stuff. And I get it, but I'm like, at the same time, you did not know this man, and he did not know you, and he would probably not give you a second look walking into the building. He may or may not stop to give you the time of day to give you an autograph. And, they always say don't meet childhood heroes because they're assholes. I don't know if Kobe was an asshole or not. But what I'm saying is that, I think you can mourn somebody, but like I just feel like you can't just like fall apart for somebody who you don't. And that's me. I can't cry for somebody who I don't know. I am sad that Hulk Hogan passed away because he did give me memories. Do I have the same memories as somebody who watched him grow up? No, but I do have some memories from him. And perhaps I do owe him a thank you because yes, back then he did save the wrestling industry and held it up enough for that next person to come to take it to the next road. I am a real American. I mean, that theme song, I used to play that. I used to have that on a CD. I remember, well, actually, he didn't come out to it. I think Pat Patterson was using it. But then later I realized that, it was a Hulk Hogan thing. But, the older generation is probably definitely sad. Those who knew him, Ric Flair and all of them, I know they're definitely sad and upset. And I feel for them. I'm sorry for them. But I just think that, when these controversial figures pass away, I think you have to look at it, in context and say, okay, this guy, I hate the fact that maybe he was a Trump supporter. I hate the fact that he made those racist comments. I hate the fact that he gave a half-assed apology. That's pretty much he was saying, if you're going to say something that's not going to be popular, make sure you're not being recorded, which is pretty much what we got from it. I'm sure there are people who were disgusted with the whole, sex tape scandal that he had sex with his friend's wife. I'm sure those people disgusted by that. But was that Hulk Hogan, the wrestler, doing that? I don't see that. I don't see that's the Hulk Hogan with the red, white, and yellow doing that stuff. And I just feel that I just feel when I just see those comments, you're just wrapping him up in just one big ball, and I just feel like you have to separate it. Now, the next thing is what I'm seeing is that they're saying that WWE needs to do this whole big tribute. WWE really hasn't done a tribute show, and correct me somebody out there if I am wrong. WWE hasn't really done a tribute show since Eddie Guerrero. And when I say that, and since then, I think before that it was Owen Hart. And when I say that is that when I say a tribute show, when Eddie Guerrero died, like the storylines were suspended. It was really all about Eddie. They did like I remember Chris Benoit and Triple H wrestling, and like Triple H hugging him at the end. Triple H coming out when in his entrance saying it's not about me, it's about Eddie Guerrero. You know, um, the tribute show that they did for Owen Hart the night after he died. They haven't done shows like that. Pretty much what they do is like now, they'll come out on the stage, they'll toll the bell 10 times, they'll show a video package, and then maybe show clips of the person's career throughout the night. I don't remember them doing that for Bray Wyatt. I remember them standing on stage, but I don't know if they had show clips. But I know they did that for the Ultimate Warrior. They stood on stage and they show clips. I don't think they did it for Sabu. Maybe they did. I don't even think they stood on stage for Sabu. I think they just did the in memory of Sabu. I think that's all they did. Um, I'm trying to remember what they did for Roddy Piper. I don't know if they really did anything for Roddy Piper, but I would be, and to tell you the truth, I would be a little surprised if they had the entire roster, because usually they'll have everybody stand out. I used to say on the stage, it's really not a stage anymore. They used to have everybody stand out underneath the Titantron, and they would toll the bell and like play a nice little video package. I would be a little surprised if they do that, and the reason why I say that is because it's a different generation of wrestlers. These wrestlers may have grown up watching Hulk Hogan, but they didn't work with Hulk Hogan. It's not like when Eddie passed away, everybody's bawling their eyes out. When Bray Wyatt passed away, everybody's bawling their eyes out. But like when Ultimate Warrior passed away, you didn't see that same scene because obviously he wasn't wrestling anymore. He was retired, and that closeness wasn't there. So I don't know if they would do that because of just the generational difference. I think they will probably, tell the arena we're going to toll the bell 10 times for him. They're definitely going to show video packages, tomorrow night on SmackDown and definitely on Sunday. And I wouldn't be surprised they did a little something at the Royal on SummerSlam for him as well. But as far as that collective, I would be very surprised if I see that because it's not like he was a producer. It's not like he was an agent. It's not like he was working at NXT. Like how Taker is still around. Shawn Michaels is still there. So like if one of them passed away, I could see everybody coming out on stage because they're there. Hogan wasn't there. Hogan did his one appearance and then that was it. And I think it's just a generational difference. And not to mention, you kind of even hear some of the new generation criticizing the old guard. And I'm not talking about like how Riddle would criticize Goldberg, but you would hear some suggestive comments made about somebody like Hulk Hogan. So I'm not quite sure how that love is going to be shown on SmackDown tomorrow. Is that roster going to come out? Are they all going to bow their heads? I don't know. I really don't know. I can see them playing a video package. I can hear the crowd chanting Hogan, Hogan, Hogan. I'm not quite sure where they are. I mean, they're in a blue stadium. It might not happen. Might get some booze. I don't know. But I just think those who are clamoring for this big tribute show, I would really be surprised. Now, if Vince was still running the show, I would say yes. But Vince is not running the show anymore. I would even say Triple H ain't running it no more. These TKO guys, they really have their claws into it right now. And I don't know if they would appreciate what would happen. Now, I know Hogan and Dana White were friends. I don't know if Dana White can have some influence on this. But it's just not the same as if Vince was there. If Vince was there, yes, I think everybody would be on that stage. And I think it would be a different kind of tribute show. I just don't see it happening. Like I said, I should stand corrected. The last big tribute shows that I can remember was Owen Hart, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris Benoit. And remember, they got a lot of blowback for the Chris Benoit one because they didn't have the whole story. They would show videos of the wrestlers, telling their memories. That's not going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. You might, I mean, I think you'll have wrestlers say, oh, yeah, when I grew up, this, that, and the other. You might have that, but I just, it's so different now. Like, they didn't do it with Warrior. It's so different now. I just don't think people are going to get what they think that they should do. I could totally be wrong, but we'll find out tomorrow. But I just don't see the wrestlers lining up, bowing their heads, and whatnot. I see them starting to show off, um, ringing the bell and all that kind of stuff, having a moment of silence. I do not see them suspending storylines. I don't see them doing that. Like I said, they only did that Owen Hart and Eddie Guerrero. I No, they canceled the show for Chris Benoit, so nobody wrestled on a tribute show for Chris Benoit because I remember I was up. I remember I was okay. Yes, because at that time, what was that? When did he die? 2007, 2008. So I was still living with my mother at the time. What was it? He died. What year did Chris Benoit die? Chris Benoit died in 2006 or 2007. Because Eddie Guerrero died in 2000. Eddie Guerrero died in 2005. Okay, so 2007. So wow, the anniversary was a month ago. He died June 24th. Okay, so I remember I was in my mother's room. I was upstairs, and I I turned the TV on in my sister's old room. I don't know what I was doing upstairs, but I remember I went across into the other room because there's another room across from my sister's room. I remember I went in there to get something, and I was getting it. I heard Vince's voice because this was right after they did the storyline where Vince's limo gets blown up. And it's like, who killed Vince McMahon? And I'm like, wait a minute, why do I hear Vince's voice talking? So I remember running back into the room and saw Vince in an empty arena talking and saying that Chris Benoit and his family were found dead. Of course, this was before we found out what the truth was. And they just sort of did a whole tribute show to Chris playing his stuff. And I just think those types of tributes are done. I don't, I'm not even sure they would do the same for Ric Flair, maybe because Triple H was close with Ric Flair. I know Triple H really respected Hulk Hogan, so maybe he will say, yes, this is what we have to do. But I think the most you're going to get is a 10-bell toll in memory of him and some video packages. Similar to what they did when Paul Bear passed away. Everybody came out, they did all that, but again, you still had like some of that old guard mixed in when Paul Bearer died, which I think now is like 10 years ago, which is, oh God, I mean, time just flies. That he died like 10 years ago. But I just think with this crop, I just think it's different. I don't know, and I don't know if that same love for Hulk is there that might have been maybe 10 years ago. I just don't see it, Like I said, I could be wrong, but I just think when we just have these controversial figures, you have to separate. It's like with Bill Cosby, because I'm going to talk about Malcolm Jamal Warner in the next video. You know, and even Malcolm Jamal Warner said it. It can be hard probably for fans of the show to watch the show knowing now what came out and what happened. It might be hard for you to watch his character kissing his wife or be on top of his wife knowing that he was drugging people and forcing himself on people. That's probably going to be hard. But again, you're trying to separate it. I'm watching Dr. Huxtable on a TV show being funny and all this. I'm not watching, Bill Cosby do this. This is a character that he's playing. So the character didn't do it, the real person did. And that's just how I try to separate. Same thing with Michael Jackson. I look at the entertainer, not what he did off camera. You could say Britney Spears has lost her mind and woman's girl's crazy. But you know what? She put out a lot of hits. I never went to a concert, but you can separate it. Just think about Bob Saget. Everybody knows him as this wholesome dad on Full House, but he was a raunchy motherfucker in his stand up, cursing, f bombs, all that stuff. And I remember the first time I saw a stand up, I'm like, what? Like that's Danny Tanner? That's like Goody Two Shoes, wholesome dad, Danny Taylor, sitting there talking about dicks and tits and curse and all that stuff? What? Yeah, because you got to separate them. That's a character he plays, and this is him, and you got to separate it. And I think you got to do the same thing for Hulk Hogan. So, I think there has to be a little bit of respect for what he did. And, again, there are people who are not going to miss him. There are people who say good riddance. Some solely for the fact that he was a Trump supporter. But, I look past that. And even though I was not a fan of Hulk Hogan, again, I gave you the reasons why I wasn't a fan, I still say thank you to him for helping the wrestling business. The match with The Rock was great. I know he had other great matches, and one day I probably will go back and watch them. And maybe one day when I have my kid, we'll sit there and watch, old wrestling videos. But it's sad, and he did revolutionize wrestling, especially when he jumped ship and he turned heel. And sometimes I wonder, how would the wrestling world look if Hogan never went to WCW? If Kevin Nash and Scott Hall never went to WCW? What if it was Taker that went? What if Shawn Michaels went? And what if Bret Hart still went? But would it have been different if Bret went there? You wonder, would WWF still be here if that never happened? Would eventually people have gotten tired of Hulkamania and WWF would have died out and WCW would have Survivor? Would WCW have faded much sooner than it did if he never jumped ship? What would have happened if he stayed after WrestleMania 19? Because when he came back in 2002, so he was there for a little over a year. And he left in 2003 after the match at WrestleMania. And they said because they couldn't come to terms on a new deal and that Hogan wanted to be, the Hogan of old, but not real. And yes, this is when The Rock was gone and Stone Cold, was done wrestling. And I think probably Hogan saw a void. It's like, hey, I could fill that void. I could, continue what I was doing before. But I don't know if it would have worked because, yes, you still had that generation of you growing up, but you still had some of these new guys coming up, and at that time they were getting ready to push Brock Lesnar to the moon. You still had, you had Kurt Angle, Randy Orton and Batista wasn't Randy Orton and Batista yet, and you had Triple H. So was there going to be room for the Hulk Hogan of old in 2003? I don't know. Probably not. And obviously, Vince did not think that the Hulkamania of the 80s was going to work and run wild in 2003. And would the same thing have happened? The whole reason that Hulk turned heel in WCW was because people were getting tired of the red, white, and yellow, and they were booing him. And that's why Eric Bischoff said, got to turn heel, and he became it, and it changed his character. It revolutionized his character, and things blew up, and that forced WWF to get their act together, and thus the Monday Night Wars was born. And, again, I wonder, what would wrestling look like if Hogan never left? Does that mean that Hall stays? Does that mean that Nash stays? Remember, those were the first two that left. Would Savage still have gone, and would Savage have been the one to keep WCW alive? We don't know. And sometimes it's fun to think about that. Like, what if Al Gore won the 2000 election and not George Bush? What would happen? What? And if that was the case, if Al Gore won, would we have had Barack Obama as president? Would we have had Donald Trump as president? Would Hillary have been president? How would it have looked if Hillary won and Donald Trump lost? Those alternate universe things that you tend to think about. What does it look like? What would have happened if Kennedy was never assassinated? That changed. That could have changed. That event changed the course of history. And yeah, let's say Kennedy was around. And I say it again: would Reagan have been president? Would Ford have been president? Would we have had two Bushes? Would we just had one Bush? So those kind of things are fun to think about. What would have happened if Hogan didn't go? What if Hogan didn't transfer into you know the movies? Would he have still been a household name? And I think the other thing that a lot of people are wondering is on his personal side. We know he went through that nasty divorce with his wife Linda. He married again, and then that marriage didn't work out. Everything that happened with Nick, and now him and Brooke haven't spoken in a long time. So where does that go? Does Brooke go to the funeral? Does this make Brooke think, okay, let's reunite with my family because there was that estrangement? I mean, death does a lot of things, and time heals all. You could be angry with somebody, and sometimes this could be a blessing in disguise for her, for Brooke Hogan, because maybe this will help her reconcile with her mom. It may or may not. She said she got to say I love you to him the last time, but saying I love you and saying goodbye, I think are two different things. You know, I was very close with my grandfather on my father's side. You know, I kind of knew he passed in 2011. I kind of knew his time was coming because at one point he needed blood transfusions, and he was getting them, I think, like once a month or once every other month. Then it became, well, now he needs it every month. Then it became he needed it every 2 months, every 2 weeks. Then it became he needed it every week. And then he was in the hospital for a really long time. And then he got to come home, but then he had to go back the same night. And then you just kind of realize, like, okay, all this stuff is going on. The end is probably coming. And I got to, say my goodbye to him. And I think maybe a week later, because I think he passed after his birthday, but before Father's Day, I think he passed away. Because I remember that's why we were visiting him. We were giving him his birthday card and telling him happy birthday. But we got to say goodbye. I would have been upset if I did get to say bye. Now, I mean, he didn't, we didn't say, oh, good, it was just, okay, bye, Grandpa, love you, that kind of thing. It wasn't that we actually sat there and talked that he like died shortly after, but I still got to give him one more I love you. I still got to give him one more hug. I still got to say goodbye to him. Brooke didn't have that. Now, will that affect her? If she even goes to the funeral, but if she goes, does that help mend the bridge, and does that help heal the family? Like I said, time heals all. You know, and I think 20 years from now, you know, by that point I'll be in my 60s. You know, if I have a kid, that kid will be in their 20s. And again, this stuff gets passed down, just like Star Wars gets passed down. I think this past May 4th, I remember seeing on TV because TBS usually does a whole big thing with Star Wars. I remember this guy saying, I used to do this with my dad. Now I get to do this with my son. And, my dad's here, so it's like a 3 generation thing. And this stuff gets passed down. Wrestling's got to get passed down. And 20 years from now, a 20-year-old from now, they're going to know who Hulk Hogan was. And plus, all this stuff is streaming. Again, if I have a kid, I have a lot of friends who have kids. I've seen them on Facebook already posting tributes to Hulk Hogan and saying, I've watched wrestling with my kid. My kid understands who Hulk Hogan is. It's going to get passed around. So people are going to know Hulk Hogan. And as time goes on, Hogan is going to be remembered more for the wrestling and, the whole racist thing, the sex tape, and him being a Trump supporter. That's just going to be a blurb. Nobody's really going to remember that. That's going to fade away over time. Because I think I think the good that people remember, like the happiness and the excitement, people are going to remember more. And I think that's going to outweigh the negative stuff. And just in this particular case, over time, I think, a lot of that stuff is going to be forgotten. But again, I just think when I just see some of those comments, I just think you have to separate the man, the entertainer, and all that stuff. You know, and then just like to end this though, what does this say about all the people who were saying there was nothing wrong with him, that he was fine and healthy? I mean, he could still been healthy and then this happened, but you know, because I already saw some of those comments already. Oh well, what does it say about Jimmy Hart? He was lying to the public. Eric Bischoff said that he was fine, nothing was wrong with him. I mean, maybe he was healthy, and then this happened. I don't know. Who knows? But you know, it is sad because I understand now how my mom and dad felt, where people they grew up with started passing away. And now a lot of the people that I have grown up with are passing away. And, again, I don't cry for people I don't know. I can't feel that, but I can be like, damn, when the Green Ranger passed away, I was like, he was the Green Ranger. He was Tommy. He was Dragon Zord and Tiger Zord, then the Red Zeo Ranger, and it's Turbo. That he came back for. I grew up with him, and now he's gone. Uncle Phil from Full House from Fresh Prince of Bel Air. Bob Saget from Full House passed away. It's like I grew up with these guys, so it does. I don't know. I don't know if sting is the right word, but I think it makes you nostalgic, and especially now on the internet, there's a lot of these nostalgic videos that will show you things when you grow up. Kids today will not, will never experience this. Do you remember all these candies that your grandparents had, the furniture that they had, or the TV shows you used to watch, and when they play that music, yeah, that gets me a little teary eyed. That gets me a little sad because it makes me think, you know, obviously we were younger, we didn't really appreciate the time that we had and what we were doing back then. But like now, because it's in our face now because of the internet, it's like, yeah, life was so much simpler back then. Yeah, we would just get around the TV to watch Seinfeld or Full House or Family Matters or something like that. And then when you see that somebody who was on that show has passed away, it's like, damn, like that person was in my childhood, and now they're gone. So I can understand the sadness, but I just can't like fall apart. But it does make me nostalgic. I mean, when David Frank passed away, yeah, I went on Roku. There's a Power Ranger channel, and I did watch some old Mighty Morphin Power Ranger episodes. I did. 30 something years old watching freaking Power Rangers. I did because I was like, oh man. And it just made me nostalgic. And I started watching it. And you know what? I'll probably go back and watch some old Hulk Hogan stuff now for that nostalgic feel. Probably. But um, Hulkamania, is not really running wild anymore. It's probably is running wild up in heaven now. Um, and I just think, again, don't hold it against the man because he was a Trump supporter. Don't hold it against, don't hold the racist stuff. Again, just try to separate the two. Let's remember Hulk Hogan, the wrestler, who gave us some great memories, and let's just remember that. Um, and I guess I'll just end it there. To just, you know, it sucks, because that is a piece of somebody's childhood. And you could definitely, you're allowed to be, just because I don't cry, and I think it doesn't mean somebody, I'm not saying you can't do that, but because I'm sure somebody is sitting back, oh, it's midnight now, but I'm sure somebody earlier today was sitting back thinking, oh yeah, me and my dad went here. Oh, I remember when Hogan did that. Oh yeah, that was the day I had my first kiss. That was the day, I took my girlfriend to a wrestling show. Oh, that was the day, my girlfriend dumped me and my buddies took me to a wrestling show and I got to see, there's gonna be some memory that's gonna be triggered because of Hulk Hogan. So thanks, Hogan. Rest in peace.